Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming along to this symposium today. My contribution is a reflection on the losses and gains in Dublin's 20th century office block inventory. The More Than Concrete Blocks book series is adamantly not a best of, and the selection of office blocks in this presentation followed that same premise. While many of the buildings I will show you are fine examples of their genre, there are also some that are subjects of derision, or perhaps even worse, they're completely ignored. Some are buildings that spark controversy when they were built because of that prejudice have had an uneasy settling into the city's anatomy. Some are cantankerous characters that we love to hate simply because we do not know how to honour them. Nonetheless, I believe each of these office blocks is a beacon of its era, a valid product of its time. More Than Concrete Blocks, Volume 3 begins in 1973. The book starts with 3 contextual essays, one for each of the decades, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, before setting the scene and allowing the reader to situate themselves in the city and imagine the conditions that gave birth to a wonderful, eclectic, and particularly Irish architecture. That is the bread and butter of our city, the ordinary, everyday stage set of our lives. More Than Concrete Blocks tells the story of myriad building types: power stations, schools, healthcare buildings, housing, churches and courthouses, monuments and office blocks. It tells the story of why those buildings are the way they are, why they were built and by whom, and how they have served their owners and their communities in the years since they were built. A fundamental principle behind the More Than Concrete Blocks project was the belief that knowing our building stock well, understanding its intricacies, and valuing it for what it tells us about ourselves is vital for a healthy and thriving city. Biodiversity is a word we understand and respect. We believe that cities need similar diversity, archidiversity, if you will, to remain healthy, vibrant, relevant, and sustainable. We need to pause and consider the loss of our archidiversity, particularly the significant loss of late 20th century office blocks, and imagine how our city can embrace that architecture and take it on the ride into the future. In recent times, my regular cycling route has changed profoundly with the loss of 3 significant 20th century Dublin landmarks: Kevin Street College of Technology, Molyneux House, and River House. Ample evidence of the increasing incidence of loss of this particular 20th century varietal. Indeed, the 60s and 70s office block is a particularly vulnerable beast, with wholesale demolition occurring across the city. The scale of obliteration is feeding the debate about architectural value. What makes a building worth conserving or worthy of substantial retention by way of adaptive reuse? Under planning legislation, local authorities are obliged to draw up a record of protected structures known as the RPS, which includes every structure which, in its opinion, is of special architectural, historical, archaeological, artistic, cultural, scientific, social, or technical interest. And I know everybody in this room is very familiar with that. However, it is very rare to find late 20th century office blocks on the RPS. This factor, combined with the fact that 60s and 70s office blocks usually sit on very valuable city real estate, makes them particularly vulnerable to demolition. There is no roadmap for the assessment of their value, and in any case, such assessment, if it is deemed necessary, falls to independent heritage specialists who earn their fees from the developers whose primary objective, of course, is to derive maximum value from the building site. It makes sense then that the sites of the 70s office blocks are primary targets for redevelopment. Nevertheless, there are a few 1970s office buildings listed on the RPS, the former Bank of Ireland headquarters on Baggot Street, now known as Museum Plaza, being one. Its recent refurbishment by its original architect, Scott Talon Walker, is an obvious exemplar to boost the position of planning authorities regarding refusing permission to demolish in favour of refurbishment. The successful, albeit costly, refurbishment at Baggot Street can show the way for developers to see the value in such upgrades. Gains must be measured not just in terms of financial return, but in the longer-term environmental benefits of sustainable development and, of course, the preservation of our archaediversity. Another lesser-known office building on the RPS is the School of Theoretical Physics at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies on Burlington Road, designed by Stevenson Gibney and Associates. Despite many lucrative offers from developers to purchase the site, the DIAS, who is the owner-occupier, has held firm. Not only that, but the building remains almost exactly as it was when it opened in 1972, complete with original furniture, library shelves, light fittings, and the most precious fixtures of all, the blackboards. The former New Ireland Assurance Company offices on Dawson Street is another example of an office building on the RPS, which is currently undergoing refurbishment and extension while retaining substantially its original form. The building is in fact an amalgam of three buildings: a 1932 office building on Dawson Lane by Vincent Kelly, a 1964 office building on the corner of Dawson Street and Dawson Lane by Morris and McCullough, and a 1971 building on Dawson Street by Patrick Campbell. The current refurbishment works, which are nearing completion, include the retention of the concrete structure and facades, and the original curtain walling system on the 71 building. And also includes many of the building's unique and important details, including Connemara marble, decorative bronze panels, original bronze-coated windows, and Irish granite linings. Planners granted permission for additional floors set back behind the parapet, showing compromise can reap benefits for all. In the context of the pervasive threat to Dublin's 1970s office blocks, these three projects represent gains, each in a different way. Unfortunately, though, the survival of office buildings like these, the gains, are greatly outnumbered by the losses. Until earlier this year, the facade of Molyneux House remained one of the most distinctive in the city. The building's unusual fortress-like form was both perturbing and intriguing. Reflective glass in the windows, now gone, denied any opportunity to spy activity within, while the periscope window and deeply recessed balcony on the fourth floor suggested covert surveillance of the street below. In its current sad state, it is all the more distressing for the fact that Molyneux House is celebrating its 50th birthday this year. Unfortunately, there's nothing to celebrate. All that remains is the skeletal outer layer of its remarkable facade. In designing that facade, Stevenson purposely retained the front wall of the original 19th century Molyneux Chapel, constructing an outer layer that broke forward from the old in an irregular manner, so that a series of uniquely different spaces was created between the old and the new skins. By retaining the outer brick layer only now in 2023, Stevenson's ingenious gesture is completely lost. A tragic irony, considering he was one of the most vociferous opponents of facadism in the 1970s and 80s. What has been lost at Molyneux House is significant and regrettable, but it began long before the wrecking balls came in 2023. Stevenson's avant-garde 1970s interiors, a gleaming white concrete frame inserted into the volume of the former church, with open-plan offices, a glass lift, an open staircase, trailing plants, and his own bespoke suite on the upper floor were gradually lost during the 1980s and 1990s. When a building is not on the record of protected structures, its interiors are particularly vulnerable to loss. AIB Bank Centre in Ballsbridge was not on the record of protected structures when permission to demolish the complex was granted in 2017. Bank Centre was designed and built as Ireland's first corporate campus, an American typology that became increasingly popular in Europe in the 1960s. The original scheme, designed by Andy Devan, comprised 15 pavilions arranged in a symmetrical composition, 9 of which were built. In 2018, when demolition began, the pavilions were in excellent condition, internally and externally. They were nevertheless perceived by their developer to be redundant, worthless artifacts of an earlier age, and because there was no official measurement of value, there was nothing the planning authorities could do to prevent redevelopment. Devan's masterpiece, and I do not think it's an overstatement to call it that, was demolished and replaced with a new scheme called Fibonacci Square. The scheme's developers chose the name because, they alleged, The renowned architect Andy Devan, designer of the AIB campus, was inspired by the Fibonacci sequence, as was his mentor, Frank Lloyd Wright. Having studied Devan's work for a number of years now, including his time under the tutelage of Frank Lloyd Wright, I have never come across a reference to Fibonacci in their work. A strange and obscure gesture in the circumstances. Devan, one of the century's most prolific architects, designed only 3 office schemes in Dublin: AIB Bank Centre, the Irish Life Centre, and Stephen Court. Efforts to get Stephen Court listed on the record of protected structures were not successful. And just last month, An Bord Pleanála withdrew, an appeal from An Bord Pleanála was withdrawn, paving the way for its imminent demolition. In the many submissions to the Planning Authority arguing against the demolition of Stephen Court, observers quite rightly pointed out that demolishing an office building to rebuild an office building was an outrageous proposal in 2022, given the climate emergency and the role and impact construction is playing on the climate crisis. This argument needs to gain more momentum. In the meantime, the only thing that may put a stay on the demolition of Stephen Court, long enough for his demolition to be reconsidered at least, is the fact that Dublin currently has an excess of availability of office space. Another building which seems to be teetering on the brink of likely demolition is Arthur Gibney's minimalist masterpiece, Marion Hall. Since the building passed from the hands of its semi-state owner-occupiers, first Irish Shipping and later Encore's Throctola, the condition of the building and its setting have deteriorated. It is now owned by a property investment company and let on a long lease to its current tenants. Although the office spaces have been recently upgraded, the concrete frame is showing signs of stress, fully repairable stress, I add, and generally the external envelope of the building and its landscape are just suffering from neglect. The reflecting pool is empty, there are cracks and poorly executed repairs in the concrete paving, and the lawns are unkempt. Marion Hall deserves better. The proportions of the office spaces are conducive to modern office demands, as can be seen in the interior photographs taken shortly after its completion. It is one of the most enduring Irish office blocks of its age. The demise of 60s and 70s office blocks started when the Irish economy began to pick up in the 2010s, when there was renewed demand for new generation office buildings. In 2017, the Bord Fáilte headquarters on Baggot Street Bridge, designed by Robin Walker and completed in 1963, was demolished. The site lay vacant, surrounded by hoarding, until earlier this year. In 2018, on nearby Wilton Terrace, one of Dublin's most identifiable 20th century office blocks, Fitzwilton House by Schulheifer and Burley, was demolished. I do not have a figure for the quantity of mass concrete that was cleared and dumped in the process. Calculations for carbon release are not a requirement of the planning permission process. Demolition of the Setanta Centre by Tyndall Hogan Hurley Architects is on hold for the time being. The decision not to proceed is not based on architectural or environmental considerations, but it is the result of a legal dispute between the developer and existing tenants. This photograph clearly shows the proximity of the Setanta Centre to Molesworth Street, a street that has seen more demolitions than any other in the city in recent times, and that phenomenon has spread into neighbouring Dawson Street and Nassau Street. While the fate of Setanta House is being decided, the famous 1970 Thorn Wall, created by artist Desmond Kinney, was taken down. It is hopefully stored safely somewhere for future reinstatement. You can see it there on the bottom left. The same cannot be guaranteed for Kinney's other great 1987 mural, known as Sweeney's Astray, shown middle left. According to one source, the mural was ripped off the wall of the Abbey Court Garden in the Irish Life Centre and packed into black plastic bags. Top left is an image of Michael Warren's timber sculpture, Noce Obscura, commissioned by architect Neil Scott for the Port and Docks headquarters on Alexander Road. Intended to be viewed from the office floors above, as it is in this photograph, the sculpture was removed shortly after the building was occupied, and its whereabouts are unknown. In the centre is a photograph of Ian Stewart's Tree of Life, cast in copper, which stood in the internal courtyard of Stephen Court. It was one of a pair of Stewart sculptures commissioned by Devan. The other, the Tree of Knowledge, was cast in concrete. Both were removed in the 1980s, and their whereabouts are unknown. At bottom right is a photograph of John Behan's stone carvings known as metholithic moments, which stood in the landscape gardens at AIB Bank Centre. The whereabouts of this artwork and others commissioned by Devan for AIB, including work by Desmond Kinney, Alexander Weishart and Anne Price Owens, are unknown. Meanwhile, Alexander Weishart's magnificent stainless steel sculpture Freedom, shown on top right, was removed when Bank Centre was demolished and has been relocated to Maynooth University, I believe. Artworks were very much an integral part of 1970s architecture, but their value and the importance of their contribution to that architecture is not recognised. Like the buildings for which they were specially designed, they have no protection. Their vulnerability is exacerbated by the fact that the removal is not considered demolition and therefore does not require planning permission. Demolitions are continuing elsewhere in the city too, and while few will lament the loss of Hawkins House and others in that particular city block, the iterative dismantling and dumping of so many thousands of cubic metres of viable building materials must call into question how value assessments are made in terms of which buildings should be retained and how materials are reused. In the past few weeks, 6 stories of Italian and Norwegian marble, along with vast expanses of custom-made Belgian window systems, have been stripped off Treasury buildings on Grand Canal Street. There are little sparks of hope, though. Engineer John Casey has been instrumental in harvesting the stripped-out materials and in repurposing materials such as steelwork from the atrium in new parts of the building. Concrete that has been removed is being repurposed as aggregate for roads. But all that pink marble, specially selected by the developer in the 1980s, is available free to anyone who would like to take it away. If you are interested, you can check out the Irish Green Building Council website. No doubt other expensive bespoke interior fittings, including brass ironmongery and porcelain bathroom fittings imported from the United States, have been relegated to the dumpster. And remember, this building was only completed in 1990. While efforts to recycle and reuse materials from the Treasury building are admirable, one cannot help drawing comparison with the removal of chimney breasts and the stripping of roof slates from historic buildings, and how such actions are now complete anathema to conservation culture. The groundbreaking work of John Casey and his team is important nonetheless, and it would be great if he could be commissioned by the Department of Heritage or the Department of Environment to report on the outcome of his efforts at Treasury Building. "1970s office buildings are troublesome, yes. There was inappropriate development, yes. There was poor quality construction, yes. But there was also hope, determination, and ambition in bucket loads. The decades of the 1960s and 1970s epitomise Ireland's concerted effort to declare itself an independent state. These buildings should be admired for what they are in their totality, not simply dismissed as irrelevant artefacts. The refurbished former Bank of Ireland headquarters on Baggot Street is one of the few listed buildings in Ireland to achieve Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design, LEED. LEED is a rating system devised by the United States Green Building Council. It measures the environmental performance and sustainability of buildings and goes above and beyond Irish regulatory standards in energy efficiency. I look forward to Ronan Phelan's presentation this afternoon. Dublin's most iconic office building of the era, Sam Stevenson's Central Bank, reimagined as Central Plaza. However, I think there are some doubts as to the long-term success of the decision to sink one of Dublin's few south-facing plazas. As yet, no tenants have occupied the Louvre-inspired glass rooftop bar and restaurant, but we are hopeful that the developers will hold the promise of making the building, particularly that roof space, accessible to the general public. Brendan Ward will tell us more later today. The success of the refurbishment of the former New Ireland Assurance Company headquarters is still to be revealed. The image on the bottom is a CGI of how the building should look when it is completed. Pascal Mahoney will talk about this afternoon also. The solutions for 20th century office buildings are not simple. The greatest hindrance to survivability is the inadequacy of the value system, assessment system as it is currently applied. It is right that Dublin City Council should have economic progress and prosperity for all citizens at the heart of its decision-making processes, but economics cannot be placed ahead of sustainability. It is estimated that 37% of carbon emissions in Ireland stem from the construction and built environment sector. The record of protected structures has a discrete set of values by which buildings are assessed for value, and then protections are applied and enforced. Should a similar set of values, protections and enforcements be made when a planning application is received to demolish a viable building? What are the criteria to be met when it comes to measuring environmental value that is so inextricably linked with cultural value? How can the loss of an architectural landmark be valued? What is the place of 20th century office buildings in our national psyche, now and in the future? What would Dublin City look like if all the 1970s buildings were ripped away? And what would future generations have to say about such an architectural chasm? There are at least 3 interlinked value systems that should be applied to making decisions about the future of existing late 20th century building stock. An RPS-type value system which measures architectural and technical attributes, a sustainability value system which considers environmental impact, and a philosophical value system which assesses the building's contribution to place, both in its immediate physical context and in the context of its contribution to the city's evolution. Together, these criteria would help the city maintain and sustain a healthy archidiversity. Only last month, journalist David McWilliams described Dublin's office market as having 3 categories. The Georgian Victorian era, which is an incredible 187 years long, the crony era between the 1960s and 1990s, and the globalization era from 2000 onwards. McWilliams' populist assertion that the so-called crony era offices were built by men in mohair suits and were largely the result of sweetheart deals between politically connected developers and their friends in government denies the much, much deeper and richer legacy of these buildings, their architects, and all those that made them. We have to look beyond commentary like this. I believe that we are now at an adequate distance to cast a critical and knowledgeable eye over the architecture of the closing decades of the century, particularly the vulnerable buildings of the 60s and 70s. They say 50 is a dangerous age for a building, and the evidence is all around us. Let's pause and consider the legacy of these buildings in terms of their value to Dublin's future. Let's recognise them for what they really are: a collection of complex organisms that sustain the city and its citizens, a precious and vulnerable element of Dublin's archidiversity. We do not want more than concrete blocks to become a book of obituaries. Thank you.